Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. My name is Badwin Nyans. I'm with the IAM in Canada. Welcome to our first webinar for 2022, and Happy New Year to all of you. We're just going to wait for another minute or so for a few more people to join, and then we'll be on our way. So bear with me for a few seconds. All right. Well, good morning again. I think it's time to start. So again, my name is Badwin Nyans. I'm with the IAM in Canada. And this is our first webinar for 2023, sorry. And we're going to start with a very interesting topic, namely risk management from effectively natural disasters to a large extent. And for that, we have with us a very interesting speaker, of course, Nikki Hastings. I'll come to that in a second. Before that, I want to quickly kind of remind you who we are and what we do. So today, your hosts, as usual, will be Tom Smith, who's hiding in the background somewhere. Hi, Tom. And myself. Tom represents the North American chapter, and I represent the Canadian chapter. As usual, because we have a large audience, we'll use the questions box in GoToWebinar for any questions that you might have. So please type them into your questions box, and I will relay them to the presenter as soon as we're done with the presentation. And of course, be therefore very specific, because I can only read what you've typed. I cannot interpret or extrapolate from there. And we're always interested, of course, in further potential case studies or subjects for webinars. So if you have one, please feel free to contact us through the IAM website, and we'll plug you into the schedule. So today's presenter is Nikki Hastings. Nikki is a project lead for the geohazard risk team, at the Natural Resources Canada, and they have a public safety geoscience program. That's what Nikki is leading. And for the last 14 years, she's been involved in developing and adapting risk assessment methods to assess earthquake and flood risks in Canada, which of course are just as applicable, I assume, elsewhere in the world. And it is increasingly becoming a risk, of course, for ourselves. She works very closely with internal and external partners to better understand how scientific knowledge can inform decision making. And of course, as asset managers, we're very much affected by these natural disasters, and our decision making has to be influenced by the potential of these natural disasters. And that's, I think, what we're going to be talking about today to some extent. Nikki currently leads a coastal flood project that brings together researchers and practitioners to share knowledge and expertise supporting disaster risk reduction strategies for coastal storm surge, sea level rise, and tsunami risks. And of course, living in Vancouver, we know all about that, since a big part of the Vancouver area is in a floodplain, and consequently very exposed to all the above. Excellent. Well, so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Nikki. Nikki, welcome. I hope you're still there, somewhere in the background. Let's see if she pops up on camera, and I will also make her presenter so that she can start sharing her slides.
Perfect, thank you. Sorry, just give me a minute here and I'll just get it set up.
Nikki, tell us where you're based in the meantime.
How does that look? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
You can see the PowerPoint?
I can actually see everything on your screen. So if you maximize your screen, or there you go. Perfect.
Does that work okay? I think
beautiful.
We've got the logistics all sorted out. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Yes. Appreciate and glad to be here this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are right now. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about a new report that we worked on. So it's called Resilience Pathways, and it was about co-creating knowledge together to understand risk and resilience. And it's focused particularly in British Columbia, but I think what you can do is take the learnings you have that we had here and share them anywhere around the world, because there's a lot of good insights. So let's start. Can I get the right? Okay, I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement. So I want to recognize that I'm grateful today to be presenting from the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam traditional and unceded territories here. And if you want to add your own land acknowledgement in the chat, feel free to do that as well. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna wake you guys up a little bit. This is gonna be, we're gonna do some engaging, and I want you to pull out your phone. So pick up your phone, and I want you to go to the, go either scan the QR code right now, and let us know where you're joining us from today. So give it a few minutes, and let me know. So there we go. Well, yeah, we'll just wait a few minutes until we get participants of the Trail BC. Nice. Toronto. Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I see. I'll give it a few more minutes. Yeah, it looks good. People are still typing. So across Canada predominantly. Wow, really across Canada. Saskatchewan, Alberta, Quebec, Washington, D.C. Wow, this is exciting. People from international as well. This is good to see. Lots of people from Toronto. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to move it on to our next question. So I can see you're all quite adept at using Slido, so glad to see that that worked well. It's always a good test. Let's move to our, let's move to our next question. So now I wanted to learn a little bit about you before we dive into risk and resilience. So how many of you have a hazards and risk vulnerability assessment? Either you've completed one in your business or your agency, or if you don't know what it is, let's, yeah, I'm looking to learn from you and see how many of you, okay, let's see. Okay, this is really interesting. Oh, that's really interesting. So a lot of you are not sure about having a hazard and risk vulnerability assessment. Some of you do, so 33%, and some of you don't. So that's very interesting to hear that. Yeah. Thank you for sharing those insights. We're going to move to our next question. So what about a business and continuity plan? So I know that this is the International Asset Managers Association. So I want to learn how many of you have a business continuity plan. What actually be really interesting to know is if your hazard and vulnerability, those who have a hazard and vulnerability risk assessment are using it to form your business and continuity plan. So I'm glad to see quite a few of you have a business continuity plan. Some of you are not sure. And some of you don't have one. This is okay. I'll give it another couple of minutes. And I really appreciate you engaging on these discussions. I like to have it, it's not just me talking, but I like to learn from one another. So yeah, that's interesting. 50% of you have a business and continuity plan. Glad to hear that. Let's move to our last question here. So now I'm going to ask you, what has been, those of you who have created a hazard and risk vulnerability assessment or who are looking to create one, what has been the biggest hurdle? So here I want you to type into the chat what's been challenging for you in terms of creating and developing a hazard and risk vulnerability assessment. Lack of understanding, yes. Exactly. What does it mean? Understanding the best resources, yeah. What's available, what information, where to get it from. Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds about right. When it's done implementing, okay, yeah, that's interesting. Develop understanding of level of service that meets protection, needs protection. Yeah, changes in staff and leadership and workforce, yeah, that can be challenging for sure. Got a couple more people, so I'm gonna quality, historical inventory and condition data. Okay, yeah, that's flip from priority list, yes, until of course the next event, large event happens. So we'll learn a little bit about that. Yes, for sure. Lots of other things pressing and demanding for sure. Got a couple more people typing right now, so I'll just love to hear and share your insights. This is really interesting to learn. Not just for me, but I'm sure all of you are interested. Not mapped to drivers properly. Yeah, the drivers of risk are a big one, and the hazards. Yeah, focusing on reactive work. That's interesting. A lot of the same things that you'll hear too later in a minute. I'll just let one more person go through, and then we'll move to our next. We'll move to the more of the presentation. Convincing clients. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Resilience Pathways report. So as I mentioned, this report, it was put together. So it's, sorry, click the button here. What it is, it's a comprehensive collection of articles. So there's actually 17 articles that are sharing knowledge and insights from a range of experts and practitioners. People who, like you yourselves, are thinking about and understanding about risk and resilience planning, as I mentioned, focused in British Columbia. And so behind each of the articles were 3 editors. So Sahar Safai from Sage on Earth Consulting, myself, and Shana Johnson from Uncover Editorial and Design. So we had 3 editors working together to help make sure that things came together nicely in terms of the report. And it's all deeply rooted in implementing the Sendai framework. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. It's just to give you a little bit of background on it because this is how the report was focused. So the Sendai framework, Canada is signed on as a partner to the Sendai framework. And there are a number of goals, policy goals, targets, and performance measures that look at both substantially reducing things like reducing global disasters, from reducing mortality, reducing number of affected people, reducing economic impacts and damage to critical infrastructure and to basic services. So the goal is to, by 2030, to start to reduce some of those impacts, and then of course to increase the number of countries that have national and local disaster risk reduction strategies and risk profiles, and to increase cooperation between developing countries and increase the availability of access to multi-hazard early warning systems. So the priorities for action, and this is how the report is focused on. The report is focused on these priorities for action, and you'll see that there are 4 priorities for action. So I noticed in the comments a lot of you talked about understanding the risks. So we'll address that piece. What do we know about the risk in terms of how it should then be used to inform policies and practices? The risk governance, of course, is really important. So the risk governance means establishing some of the regulatory and accountability frameworks, increasing that collaboration, which is necessary to bring that whole society approach. And of course, investing in risk reduction, it doesn't just happen. You need funds to actually make this happen. And then of course, managing the residual risk. And when I talk about managing the residual risk, this is strengthening that emergency preparedness, which is the recovery and the Build Back Better planning. That's how the report is framed into these priorities for action. So I thought I'd bring your attention to these components. And then the framework is not a standalone framework. Some of you, this is old hat, you know it well already, but there were 3 global frameworks for resilience that were signed at the same time. So the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which we just talked about, and then the COP climate change Paris Agreement that looks at reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and then the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're all aligned together. If we're going to be building resilience and strengthening to disasters and climate change, then we need to bring the 3 frameworks together. So I wanted to bring your attention to the importance of these 3 frameworks. And the 3 components of disaster risk reduction, the Sendai framework, are really focused on first, not preventing the creation of new risks, so building in high hazard areas and not increasing what we have. Reducing the existing disaster risk, so that's understanding where are vulnerable structures, where are vulnerable people, and so on, and understanding what future looks like. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, managing the residual risk, and that's through emergency management practices, and making sure that it's a risk-informed process, and that really is what we've learned is that was not one person that could do this, but it's really a whole of society approach. If we're going to reach resilience, then we need many people to come together to make this happen. It's not just one person who can make this happen. So the objectives of this report, as I mentioned, framed in the Sendai framework, which I've just given you that background a bit for, was to share some knowledge and information about existing practices and capacities to deal with disaster risk reduction, and to advance our understanding, providing guidance for path forward. So we understand kind of the base of the state-of-the-art knowledge of what practices are taking place right now. And then, as I mentioned, implementing the Sendai framework. And in British Columbia, there's a new Emergency Program Act that's being modernized right now. So the intent was, because we're focused in British Columbia, this report is to help inform the new Emergency Program Act. But as I mentioned, the work from this report will be invaluable for other places around the world and across Canada. So primarily, the audience is really knowledge seekers and actors in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, and those include practitioners and policymakers, the public and private sector, and of course nonprofit sectors and researchers. So it's quite broad-reaching. It's intended, as I mentioned, as a reference and a resource, and as a baseline to monitor progress and actions. And it really was a collective and strategic voice for a way forward. And really, it could not have happened with the help of so many people. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to share you some insights from the report. So the first section is a strategic summary for policymakers. And these were some of the recommendations. So as I said, there were nearly 100 people that contributed to this report. And we sat down and had many workshops and many discussions to talk about what are the themes to reimagine disaster risk reduction and a climate risk management in terms of some of the policy recommendations. And really interesting to see some of the recommendations that came out of this report. This is from the strategic summary to make sure that future strategies, when dealing with disaster risk reduction, that they have action plans that are both measurable, have measurable targets, that have timelines, and that are accountable, so that we can see where we're starting from and where we're going and how things are changing if we are actually reducing risk or we are increasing the risk. And then some of you mentioned this in the comments, that really to move from being reactive, which we tend to be right now in some cases. The disaster happens, we rush in afterwards following the event, and we're trying to quickly deal with the repercussions. Let's be more proactive right now. How can we be proactive in terms of some of the governance approaches and some of the financing that can be invested right now to start to make us more resilient? And then thirdly, to embrace Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous people have been living in Canada since time immemorial, have a good understanding of the land and the connections with the natural world. So making sure that we recognize and incorporate Indigenous knowledge into our discussions around resilience. And fourthly, making sure that disaster risk reduction is in alignment with climate change adaptation. In many cases, climate change adaptation has been going forward, but we actually really need to bring them together. They are connected, and recognizing some of those commonalities. And then fifthly, the last theme that came out of this is to deal with systemic inequities. So, really our society is only as strong as our most vulnerable. So with the existing inequities, climate change and disasters just exacerbate inequities in our society. So making sure that we address those. So those are the key 5 themes, but there's a lot more to the strategic summary, so I really encourage you to read this section. Let's move into the various chapters. So here we go, chapter 1. Chapter 1 focuses on the hazard threats. And so you can see there are a number of hazards that are addressed, focusing in British Columbia, but as I mentioned, could be used to inform other areas across the country. The intent was, and as I mentioned, we had 17 articles, and we had lots of contribution from people from various organizations, professional associations, various government agencies, nonprofit agencies, and we were able to put together articles from snow avalanches, landslides, volcanic threats, wildfires, coastal floods, earthquakes, and riverine floods. We do recognize that there are more hazard threats within the province of British Columbia, but this is what we were able to put together essentially in a year of time, so it was quite impressive. So those of you who have a good understanding of the risk framework this is how we frame our understanding of risk, to first understand what is the exposure piece on the left-hand side of the diagram. So who and what are in the way of a hazard event. So that's the people and the buildings and the infrastructure. And then we need to understand about the hazard. So how big is it? Where is it? How does it happen? Some information on the vulnerability. So that's the vulnerability of people and buildings and infrastructure. Who and what are susceptible, and some people can recover pretty quickly from following an event and have more capacity to deal with it. Some buildings are more vulnerable than others from events. So understanding those vulnerabilities, and then the likelihood of it happening. So how often will it happen? You know, an earthquake, the frequency of a large event happening will be much longer than, say, you know, the heat domes, which seem to be happening on a regular basis now. And then, of course, this all starts to inform a consequence of who and what is impacted from these various hazard events, for all the hazard events that we addressed in this chapter. And then ultimately, what are the potential impacts that from these risks? This is all framed in the ISO risk management framework. So thinking about the broader picture of the framework. So we can do a risk assessment, but it needs to be framed in that, you know, full picture of establish the context, who and what are the values that are important to the communities. And then the risk assessment is, as I mentioned, the identifying, the analyzing, and evaluating. And finally, all this information then informs our mitigation and adaptation strategies. So without a good, solid understanding of what the risks are, it's really hard to mitigate or adapt to and prioritize effectively. So of course, this requires communication and engagement with the communities and the various rights holders and stakeholders that are involved in like yourselves, that would be involved in a risk management framework, as well as monitoring and reviewing and evaluating. So give you a sense of what it looks like. So what we asked people to do, we put together a template of the chapter. So you can see we wanted to be able to compare, for instance, avalanches to volcanic threats, to earthquakes, to all the various hazard threats. So we asked each of the authors to address each one of these components about the hazard and risk, or describe the hazard and risk threat, to talk about the past hazards and threats. Someone mentioned that the importance of understanding the past hazards and threats. So you'll see that in each one of the chapters. And the drivers of risk, what's keeping this increasing and moving forward? And what are some of the sources of information that help us understand the current practices that are taking place across British Columbia, and then some of the gaps. And then we really wanted to understand, how are people reducing the risk? So what sources of information help us reduce the risk? Are there risk reduction practice policies and capacities, and gaps? And then finally, some of the opportunities and recommendations. The recommendations are really insightful. We asked each lead to come up with up to 10 recommendations of how to move this forward. How can we become more resilient? So the framework, I think, was really insightful to keep things consistent across hazards I mentioned. So the approach was, most of the articles have up to 2 lead authors, and they're usually from different agencies. And then they put together a committee of experts that they knew that would have and could contribute knowledge and information. So there was both the sort of the objective questions that came from information and review, plus the subjective information, as you can see in the template. And a number of the authors led surveys and had a number of workshops to be able to pull together that information. And then this all came back to the editors, and the editors, we all reviewed through each of the articles, looked at them, make sure that they met the requirements that we were looking for, that they were easy to read, that we could pull out key themes and pieces to it, that it was consistent. So there's a really nice structure to it. It makes it really easy to read each one of the articles, but it was invaluable to have that full comprehensive approach. But that's how the articles were put together. So I'm going to dive in a little bit more into some of the, you can see some of the themes that come out. So this is each one of those hazard threat articles, and I just pulled out some of the past hazard threats in British Columbia. So you can see a range of impacts from each one of these hazard threats. So from avalanches, I'll just dive in a little bit into one of the past hazard threats. For instance, let's look at avalanches. Not many people talk about avalanches, but avalanches I would say, I always thought them as the gold standard. Really, Canada does an amazing job with the risk management for avalanches, and internationally recognized for the work that's being done through Avalanche Canada. So avalanches historically impacted a lot of infrastructure projects. So you can see from the impacts, there were impacts to railway workers, to mine workers, and this was, but we learned from that, and well, the people who are working in Avalanches learned from that and put together some good mitigation strategies to, do things like blasting areas where they knew their high avalanche hazard and risk, where there were infrastructure projects and going on. And now there are less and less impacts to, some of these resource projects that are out there in the backcountry areas that may be impacted. There's some good forecasting and warning and monitoring in place now for avalanches. But the biggest change has been of the last few years is more and more people in British Columbia in particular are going out to the backcountry. These are recreationalists, and you can see that the number of recreationalists, the fatalities from recreationalists has increased. So now there's been a change of how to communicate the risk and think about it and mitigate against some of these risks. So it's interesting to see the change. Risk assessment, it's not static, it changes over time because the activities change over time. So yeah, I thought you might be interested to take a look at some of the impacts. You might be interested to see, for instance, that some of the volcanic threats. Quite a number of years ago, there was and I will not be able to say this properly, the CX cone in northern British Columbia, that where nearly 2,000 people died from that volcanic eruption. So we cannot ignore volcanic threats. They may not happen as frequently, but they can be quite devastating. So I'll give you a sense of some of the hazard threats across British Columbia. And now let's move into the how do we understand some of those hazard threats. So you're wondering how this information is collected and pulled together so you can actually make that decision. So the who, what, the where, the when, the why, and how. And of course, hazard and risk mapping is instrumental. And I touched on that in a couple slides ago, what that means and what that looks like in terms of the risk assessment. And then a lot of the different approaches for different hazards are to use surveys and monitoring stations. So for instance, in the seismic world, there are quite a number of monitoring stations across Canada that record when any earthquake activity happens. Forecasting, of course, is important. So we think about storm forecasting and knowing that storms are coming so we can be prepared for them before they happen. And early warning, so if you have some time, so not every one of these hazards has forecasting, surveying, or early warning, but some do and some don't, and you'll get a sense if you read into the chapters which are more advanced. But early warning gives you some time to get ready, to get your gear in place, to get out of there before the flood comes in, or to have those few minutes before damaging earthquake comes in. And then of course, past hazard threats is really important. We can learn from the past. We can see what gets impacted and how and when. So it's really important to collect that information. Some of the hazard communities are collecting better and more information, and sometimes it's really hard to find that information. So I can tell you that is invaluable information, but it can be quite challenging to get access to past events. There's limited information about it, especially if you're thinking from the asset management side of things, and you're trying to learn where or what how your infrastructure may have been impacted from various hazard threats in the past. And then finally, guidelines. Some are invaluable to help inform best practices. So that's a sense of some of the approaches taken to understand the risk. Now, one of you mentioned about what's driving the risk. So this is really interesting to hear from, and I dug through each one of the articles to get a better sense of what is actually driving the risk. And so you can see there's a range of things. Predominantly, one of the biggest ones is population growth and land development. We continue to be putting people in harm's way in building infrastructure in the floodplains, building in areas of high volcanic risk, or so on. So having this information inform land use planning and future land use planning is so essential. If we're going to be becoming more resilient, then we need to better understand what our population growth is going to look like in future, making sure that we're not putting people in harm's way. Climate change is another one, of course, that came up, with that's driving the risk. Increased storms, increased temperatures, sea level rise, a whole bunch of things are increasing hazard risks and vulnerabilities. And then what else is driving the risk is existing vulnerable buildings. So we know, for instance, there are quite a number of vulnerable buildings that are built before certain building codes that may be more vulnerable to seismic ground shaking. And thinking about people and understanding people that may be more vulnerable to different hazard events. So we need a better understanding of where and who those people are. Fragmented governments. That's one thing that we really touch on with the Sendai framework, is thinking of that whole society that really, it's such a big complex problem. To understand it, we really need to be able to think of how we can work together more effectively to share knowledge, share practices, to you know, we can do much more together than we can individually. And then diving into some of the specific hazard threats, thinking about overloading slopes with fill that increases landslides, for instance, and increased activity in mountainous areas, of course, is driving the avalanche risk. Let's move into what some of the articles talk about in terms of how we manage the risk. This is really interesting to see. So managing the risk can be through the exposure. So that's understanding people and buildings and how we can adapt buildings to either to deal with the hazards. So adapting, for instance, on coastlines to sea level rise, elevating structures and floodplains, and protecting areas by building dikes or by building infrastructure, berms to prevent landslides from coming into communities, or fully retreating communities and retreating buildings that may be in. So that's about managing the exposure and reducing the exposure. So once we know and have that information, we're using some of these tools to help reduce the risk. Modifying the hazards, as I mentioned before, is talking about things like changing the way the hazard flows. So it may be in areas like where there's high avalanche risk, where you do some blasting to get rid of the cornices and to stop and reduce the avalanche hazard, or to have water flow into reservoirs so it's not flooding into downstream areas. That's how you can modify the risk. Decreasing vulnerability, so arming, or this can be through building codes, through retrofitting, things like seismic retrofits. So how can we reduce our vulnerability? And that's happening in some places. And of course, response plans, making sure we have response plans in place so we can be ready for that event when it happens, and act as quickly as possible and get people and assets out of harm's way. Building codes, of course, are invaluable for managing the risk, and we have strong building codes for some hazards, but not for all. And then, of course, individual preparedness. So these are some of the ways that the articles show how we're addressing to manage risk. But let's look at one of the gaps that was identified, and this is a big one that's identified, and this really speaks to you, the asset managers, I think in particular, will be interested to know that many of the communities and organizations really addressed a concern about understanding the impacts of cascading risks. So how do we understand what are the downstream effects when the power goes out? How does that affect government structures and banking, or the hospital gets impacted and shut down because of the sewage systems are shut down from an earthquake, and then the hospitals are shut down. So how does that then impact how we deal with fatalities and people who need critical care? And the supply of flow and supply of goods and services, of course, if transportation is disrupted or power is disrupted. So I think what's really said and what come across strongly in the articles is we need to have a better understanding of what those cascading impacts are, especially through critical infrastructure, what that means for society and community. So the communities are really asking for that information. Okay, so that's chapter 1. Now let's move into chapter 2. So chapter 2 looks at more on the practice side of things. We have 4 articles that are written from 4 sides of the practice, from critical risk and mitigation and critical infrastructure to social infrastructure. And you're going to find this one quite interesting, in community resilience, risk and resilience approaches in electrical infrastructure, and seismic design for the buildings for functional recovery. So now we'll dive into these articles a little bit further. So you might ask, so critical infrastructure gives us a sense of some of the. It talks a little bit about the renewal of the national strategy for critical infrastructure. You can learn a little bit more about that by reading the article, and about the importance of building relationships and partnerships. And then we talked about that, and the interdependencies associated with critical infrastructure failures and systems that cause upstream and downstream effects. And of course, some of this information is very sensitive, so making sure that sharing and protecting information. So if you're interested in critical infrastructure, take a look at that article. Social infrastructure, we as human beings and people can actually have more resilience just by working together and sharing knowledge and some of the programs and services that we have to work together. So recognizing the importance of social infrastructure and how we can build upon that, and making sure we're strengthening that and including that into our resilience planning and to our risk assessments. What's the social infrastructure that we may have in place to help mitigate and bounce back and become more resilient. So this is a really interesting article, I think you'll find, about the importance of social infrastructure. Electrical infrastructure is an interesting article in terms of thinking about some of the changes that are happening, what with the electrification of transportation and the changes with climate change and some of the stresses that the electrical infrastructure system is dealing with right now to deal with disaster risk reduction and climate change. And then finally, on the practitioner side, the seismic recovery article talks about looking beyond the life safety design. So building codes for most structures, not all structures, is typically designed for life safety, so intended so that the structure is not going to fall and cause fatalities. But it may mean, what it can mean is that the structure may not be functioning afterwards. It may, prevent fatalities, but the major key structures may not be functioning after. So how can we think about, and it talks about a number of tools to think about functional recovery of buildings, in particular from earthquakes. So that's a really interesting article. Let's move into, so that's chapter 2. Chapter 3 stresses on, in terms of enabling action. So these are the roles of various players that are involved in climate and disaster risk management. So the role of media is often not talked about, but the role of media plays a really important role in disaster risk reduction. Professional associations, of course, are very involved in disaster risk reduction. Then we have an article that talks about the National Disaster Mitigation Program. This was a program that was a national program, but we're going to focus specifically on British Columbia in this article. And then finally, how can we share information more widely through an open disaster risk reduction data platform, and the importance of sharing data and best practices to do this. So let's look at the roles of these various players, and each of these articles will dive in a little bit more into the roles of the players. So media, as you know, plays an important role, especially as a crisis is evolving. They're the people, media shares the message right away as the crisis is unfolding to the public and lets us know what's happening, what's going on. And the media breaks down some really complex issues, have to bring in technical people, scientists to say this is what's happening and this is what it means, and to make that understandable to the public as a whole. And also the importance of sharing some of those personal stories that help motivate action and change. So take a look at this article. It's really interesting to see the role of media it plays. This is just touches on a few of the issues, but the importance of engaging and understanding how media plays in disaster risk reduction. Professional associations, of course, write professional practice guidelines that some of you may have to adhere to. They have continuing and ongoing education and training, especially around disaster risk reduction in some cases, and of course the importance in collaborating. We set up national conferences every year and collaborating and connecting with professionals. So a big role that professional associations play. So take a look at that article, and of course that was written, each one of these articles was written by experts in each one of these fields. The National Disaster Mitigation Program was a program that ran for a number of years, has had 4 streams of funding, from risk assessments to flood mapping, mitigation, and small scale infrastructure program. Some of you may have been involved with this program. This article in particular focuses on some of the outcomes of the National Disaster Mitigation Program and how that helped to inform and what it supported. It was a focus on flooding in particular. So if you want to learn a little bit more about those projects, take a look at that article. And then finally in this chapter, the role of open disaster risk reduction. So here we're looking at a new platform that looks at this is a tool that demonstrates best practices to share hazard information, making it widely available to people like yourself so that you can understand what's at risk and what you should be concerned with. Now this platform in particular, it focuses on earthquakes. The website, if you want to write this down, is www.riskprofiler.ca. Please take a look at it. I encourage you to take a look at it and get a sense of how and what kind of information can be shared with people like yourselves to better understand the risk. So as I mentioned, this is a focus on earthquake risk, and that this article talks about some of the best practices around sharing of data. And finally, the last chapter focuses on some of the research work, and this research work came out of the disaster, the DRR Pathways project. This was a project that focused on new methods and tools and risk assessment approaches to look at some of the range of things, how to address earthquakes and floods and multi-hazards for, in particular, the lower mainland region of British Columbia. And it really helped to advance some of the science and knowledges and approaches. And so we've captured a couple of articles here to share some of that research work. And it's actually ultimately because of this research project that this report was put together. The partners that were involved in this research project said, if you want to document the work out of this research work, you need to go one step further and you need to document all of the hazards in British Columbia and go beyond earthquakes and floods. And you can see we've done this. It's quite impressive, the amount of work that was put into this report. But yeah, so I'm going to talk. So the two research articles are, one is about risk dynamics. So as I mentioned, risk changes over time. So this looks at the changing, what happens when the population changes. And we know, in particular in Metro Vancouver, we're looking at where we know that population, what are the projected population changes and how does that affect the risk? Does it increase it or does it change it? Then the other piece is to look at mapping neighboring social vulnerability in Vancouver in particular. So these are the two articles you can look at that focus on some of the research side of things. So risk dynamics, so looks at how do neighborhoods change over time. As I mentioned, how when population changes, so we know by 2050 there's going to be X number of people in this neighborhood and that neighborhood. What does that mean in terms of this area, which we know is high earthquake risk, high flooding risk? It's built on a floodplain in many cases. What does that mean in terms of the risk? What are the changes when you change, the projected changes from buildings going from single family to high rise? What does that mean to the risk? Is it increasing the risk? As we are looking at in the Sendai framework, are we reducing it? Are we changing it? So it dives in a little bit more about some of the dynamics, the risk dynamics. And then finally, the neighborhood vulnerability puts together a mapping framework that starts to map areas that may be more social, they may need more help following a disaster, that may have some inequities already starting in, and can be, those inequities can be increased as following a disaster. So that have a better understanding of where neighborhoods that may be more vulnerable than others. So if you're interested in the neighborhood vulnerability, please take a look at that article as well. So this was the advisory committee. So you can see there were a lot of players that were involved in the Pathways project initially, and then of course the people who actually wrote the articles on top of this are even more. There, as I mentioned, there are almost 100 people involved. So people from Avalanches Canada, from some of the research institutes, so a whole range of people. So I just wanted to give you kind of a sense that these were the people involved in the DRR Pathways project that instigated this report. So finally, I think what I've hopefully shared with you that there's really no silver bullet solution, that we're looking at a range of things, and it's really the people who have the agency to do something about this. It's about the information and risk management. How do we get access to it? How do we develop it? How do we share it? And some of the governance mechanisms that are functioning, be able to do something with this information, to reduce the risk, to finance it, and think about how it can be used. And this is my last slide here. And this is basically what I've put up here now is a link to the report. So you can either use your phone to scan the QR code on the right-hand side of your image to get access to the report. And you'll find, so we've made a website that's specifically targeted for the report. You can either download the full report or parts of the report, like the strategic summary or specific articles. And there are also some videos as well on the website. So if you want to look at some of the videos that address some of the chapters in particular. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take it back to you, Budwa.
Thanks, Nikki. That was phenomenal. So for all of you, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the question box. And I see that there's a couple of popping in. Hold on, let me just go back to. Oh, this is a very horrible interface. Sorry about that. Let me just maximize my screen here so I can see them better. There you go. We're going to start at the top. Can the hazard and risk tools in the report be applied to asset portfolios outside of BC? What hazards are included?
Yeah, so, well, as I mentioned clearly, you can look at some of this information, and I think you can take the lessons learned from British Columbia and use them for across Canada. You can see right away from the template of the report how it's really structured in terms of thinking about disaster risk reduction, thinking about alignment with the Sendai framework. Some of the hazards, of course, are going to be slightly different across the country. For instance, the North, permafrost is an issue, and how are you dealing with permafrost change? That's quite different than what British Columbia has to deal with. But that said, you can learn from the approaches, and I outlined in one of the slides all the hazards. I don't know if you want me to go back to that hazard slide, but you can see that we addressed a number of hazards. We didn't address all of the hazards, but more work can be done to address the hazards. But what we wanted to do within a 1-year time frame, it was pretty impressive to be able to pull each one of these articles together. But there's definitely more hazards like drought that could be addressed, tsunamis that should be addressed, and a bunch of other hazards as well. But yeah, I'm hoping that this report can be useful for others to learn about approaches to take to better understand and think about hazard and risk, not just understanding the hazard and risk, but addressing it, management.
And I assume, Nikki, that the slides that you just used we can make those available to the audience, right? Since they effectively cover the report.
For sure, for sure.
Okay,
and
perfect.
Don't forget the reports. The report's online. There's a lot more details than I could have presented.
Very good. No, that covers it. So next question is then, do the different levels of government currently play a role in terms of providing incentives and guidance for helping the private sector become more resilient?
Yeah, that's a hard one for me to answer because I'm not managing the funding programs for all the government agencies, but I do know that there are a number of funding programs. I probably can't speak to that well enough. There may be others on the call who know of some of the funding opportunities for the private sector, but a number of them are through government sectors that then apply for funding and then hire private consultants to do some of the work. But yeah, I'm not clear of all the, so I don't know if I can address that question properly. That's not my expertise, but so if someone else has that answer, I think want to add, or they know of existing funding programs, I encourage you to add it to the chat if you can.
Actually, it ties into a question that I scribbled down as you were talking, and that is, does the report attempt to put a monetary value on the risk? So in other words, do we know what it's going to cost us if these different events happen? And by extension, that gives you an idea of what we might potentially be able to spend to mitigate them. Yeah,
so this is a high-level report. It's 100 pages and it covers, 10 hazards, and it covers the role, it covers the management. It's not a complete. The idea is that you learn about the background, about the hazard risk and the current practice. It's not a complete risk assessment for every single hazard and threat that's out there. But what it will do is it gives you references to dive in a bit more and learn. So some of the hazards will have done, have quantified some of those risks a bit more. I think in some cases we're still in some of our infancy stages in terms of developing a really comprehensive risk assessment for each one of the hazards and threats. That work's underway right now in some of them, but yeah. So in terms of the costing, that's ultimately where we need to go, though, is to have that costing and then to look at different mitigation alternatives. What if you do this, then what's the cost? What if you do that? What's the future going to hold? So it's thinking about those scenarios. But yeah, that's not really the intent of this report, is to do a detailed drill. You can see there's a little bit of costing information in terms of to understand that background, but this is not a deep dive for every single hazard. That would be a 100-page report for each one of those, probably.
That's right. That's right. Next question. This is from Carlo. He says, okay, we're generally talking about natural disasters in your presentation. What techniques and methods are used to mitigate the risks, either wittingly or not, caused by human factors? So, for instance, terrorism, sabotage, crime, war, etc. Would that be similar? Is that different? How do you see that?
The risk assessment. So yes, this focused on natural hazard assessment, and that's definitely my background and interest. Working from the Geological Survey of Canada, we're focused on the natural hazard side of things. The human caused hazards assessment. So I would say that the risk management framework, which is very widely used, can be used across other types of hazards as well, and some of the mitigation adaptations strategies would be similar, but yeah, there will be some differences for sure. But yes, the intent of this report was to focus solely on natural hazard threats and assessments.
Does the report provide historical data to capture risk from? Sorry, I can't read. So historic data to capture risk and resilience assessments. So in other words, yeah, do we go back in history and does it tell us what the future might look like?
So each of the articles does talk about past threats. It's not a full comprehensive database of past threats. I can tell you when I started working on the flood article, for instance, I worked on the riverine flood article. I first went in, dived through the Canadian disaster database, pulled out every one of those flood events that of course were triggered to disaster financial assistance. But the report does not go into detail about as I mentioned, it's to talk about some of the strategies and the thinking. It's not to give that comprehensive, but it does tell you where you can find some of that information, so you can look at it, where it's captured. In some cases, it's not captured, right? So in detail. And that is something that's something close to my heart. I really would like to see past and historic events captured in more detail to be able to share what we've learned from the past, because we can learn so much from, and disasters often happen in the same places over and over again, and we keep building in those places, and then we need to learn from the past for sure. But yeah, so the report will show you, as I mentioned, some of the highlights, some of the past hazards and threats, but it's not a comprehensive, it won't provide you a comprehensive database of each past event.
Actually, that one thing that I scribbled down again as you were talking was about past events was, of course, a natural inclination of humans to be optimists and to forget the past, or at least the nasty past. Is that something that you found back in your work, or?
That is something I've seen in my work. I've actually, in drilling into the flood risk work, I can see that there's communities that have repeat flood events over and over and over and over again. And so it's that whole reactive, proactive thinking, and and how can we move away from that reactive approach? So we, flood event happens, and then we keep building more and more structures, and we build up dikes. Building a dike, for instance, doesn't mean that people are safe behind it necessarily, because dikes can fail. But what does that look like? So yeah, I think you've hit it on the nail there.
Yeah. Well, I'm Dutch, so building dikes is something which is definitely a key strategy for us. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a country.
Yeah, and actually, and I can tell you in particular, if you want to dive into one of the articles, the flood article, we looked at one of the communities in British Columbia, Grand Forks, who had a major flood event in 2018, and their approach now is to look at an integrated approach as opposed to a single, let's just build dikes everywhere. They're taking part of the community and they're turning it. They bought out some of the structures, and they're turning part of the community back, allowing the river to flow back through its original path, and then rebuilding and building and forcing dikes in other areas. They're using an integrated combination approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's a broader thinking. Yeah.
You mentioned the risk dynamics and the fact that risk changes over time. Is there therefore, I guess, depending on the type of risk, is there recommended frequencies at which risk should be reassessed?
Now, I don't know. I mean, the research that was done was for one hazard, predominantly focused on earthquakes. So it wasn't for all hazards. So it would be different for different hazards, because the recurrence of earthquakes is different than the recurrence for floods, different for droughts, different for avalanches. But I think you can also frame it in terms of thinking of growth strategies. So for instance, in the Lower Mainland, where this research work was focused, the projected growth strategies are over a certain period of time, because it's a time that, like, it's either by 2050, a lot of them went to, and then you may want to think of a little bit more longer term. So I can tell you with things like sea level rise and coastal flooding, we're going up further to 2100. So it's not, there's not, I don't think I can really answer that question. I think you'd want to think of a range of different time frames, and it would really depend on the decision making you're looking to decide on, what the decision of your asset that you're thinking of, whether it's 100 years or 50 years or 10 years, or yeah. But
we're coming to the end here, but you did mention media and the role of media in of course, relaying what's going on and informing the public, and potentially also, I guess, kind of giving guidelines as to what needs to happen next, etc. Now, of course, more and more we get social media, which could effectively throw a massive spanner in the wheel, because it might actually send disinformation or create chaos, basically. Have you looked into that, or is there like an approach that is recommended with regards to social media?
Well, the article on the role of the media, no, I didn't write that article because I'm not a media expert, does touch on the aspects of social media and changing how information gets out. I can tell you it's interesting. I've heard things like the city of Calgary, for instance, use social media following the large flood events in Calgary, and how invaluable it was to quickly get information out as well. But you're right, there's the whole trusted source of information and making sure that it comes from an authoritative source. And I have heard that from working from a government agency, that making sure that anything that, for instance, comes out of a government is a trusted and authoritative source. So I think you use your discretion in terms of looking at media in terms of the source of where it comes from. But yeah, I would dig in a little bit more about the role of the media article if you want to learn a little bit more about that. But it is an interesting thought, and the importance that media and social media plays in disaster risk reduction and resilience.
Yeah. Good. Well, I mean, the last comment comes from Tom. His comment is, this is a very interesting and hopefully useful format for inspiring collaboration on the topic. What is your experience, expectation on how it will be accepted and how widely it will be used?
Well, I would like a lot of people to use it, because a lot of people volunteered their time and contributed their time and effort to make this happen. As I mentioned, it was a year in the making. It was not easy. I had a lot of working on the weekends and sleepless nights to get it in place. So a lot of effort, sweat and tears were put into this. I would like to, my vision, and I don't know what's going to happen next, but we have socialized it at the Emergency Preparedness and Business Continuity Plan. I can tell you the province of British Columbia is looking at the report and using it to help inform some of their decision making, and I'm hoping that people like people on the call here find it useful, and we'll take a look at it now to learn a little bit more about it. But yeah, it has, because we had also keep in mind, because we had nearly 100 contributors to the report, but we had a lot of people that paying attention to it because they were involved in it. But yeah, we'll like to get it out there a bit more widely for sure. It is published online.
Thank you very much, Nikki. This was a real, it's an important topic for sure, and a very interesting one. Were there any surprises for you when you saw the end results of the work? Things that you did not expect?
The big surprise was that, first of all, that we were able to get that many people to contribute their time and effort. People are busy, and they did this off the side of their desk. They already have other projects going on, and the passion and enthusiasm that came out of from the authors and contributors to be able to put this together, that really blew me away, that people were willing to do that in their busy schedule, seeing how important this was to get this message across. So that's why I really would like to see more and more people read it now. And then just the other thing that surprised me is the comparison, the overlap between the hazards and risks, and how a lot of them are similar. The struggles and challenges are similar across hazard and risks, although there's some slight differences, but there's a lot of similarity in how we can learn from each other. And it's really brought home to me that this is a whole society approach, that we cannot do this together. As I mentioned, I don't know anything about avalanches, really. I don't really know that much about volcanic threats. So it's if we want to bring this bigger, broader picture together, we need to bring a bigger, broader group together. And I think just being in this session today has made me realize that the role of, one thing I would have liked to have seen that maybe happens in the next edition, is the role of the private sector. I'd love to see an article on the role of the private sector and how you see yourselves fitting into this, because the role of the private sector, of course, plays a big role in disaster risk reduction.
Absolutely, absolutely, and also they're just as impacted as the public is by disasters. I mean, like within our association, we talk a lot about resilience as a priority in asset management, and basically hardening your assets increasingly to climatic events and others, because it does affect your operations, of course, on an ongoing basis. Well, excellent. thanks for that. I'm going to conclude very quickly by reminding you that if you're interested in what we heard today and many of the other topics that tie into asset management, you should join us at the Institute of Asset Management to further your knowledge. We have branches both in the US and in Canada, as you see on screen. And we learn from each other very much, I guess, in the way that Nikki did through this effort, and that's really the way that we will progress. Next up, you should, of course, stay on top of things by kind of regularly visiting the IAM.org, where more events will be announced, including webinars and local events in different branches. The two big conferences this year from the IAM will be first the virtual international conference on June 14th and 15th, and then the North American conference this year will actually be in Canada, in Toronto for the first time, and that will be on October 23 to 25th. So I hope to see you at both of those events, and also at the webinars that will be upcoming on a regular basis. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this session. It has been recorded, so it will become available soon on the IAM website, and I wish you well.